Brian, how's it going?
Good to be here.
I'm joined today by Ryan Mullally. Is that how you pronounce your name?
Mullally. It's
Mullally.
incomprehensible, which is kind of a downside. It turns out that I used it for my X handle and no one can spell it. So that was kind of a bad branding move.
Well, sorry, my brain had to catch up there. X, Twitter. I got really confused for X's. Okay, I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Either
Okay,
one.
use it for, yeah. Bad branding. I'm sympathetic to that. My last name is Bonnell, and Bonnell. It gets pronounced a million ways. Sometimes in one debate it'll be announced or pronounced a million different ways.
I thought it was Vermicelli.
Yeah, a lot of different places. Not bad for branding. I'm jealous of people with simple first names and last names.
Stephen King. That's a strong name.
Close, yeah. Although sometimes people spell Stephen with a PH, so even Stephen's not the best first name. At least you have an okay first name. You were brought in today to annihilate me on lawyerly stuff. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure.
People know who you are, what you are.
My name's Ryan Mullally. You can find me at Ryan C. Mullally, which has 4 L's in it, so sorry about that, on X. So I think I got brought in today because...
Who are you? What are they... why should we care about you? You're a random guy from the street or what?
I mean, basically. I'm a former New York City public school teacher. I did Teach for America and did that for 7 years. Then went to law school, did the whole big firm thing, did a couple really high profile pro bono cases, and clerked in the Southern District of New York, which is kind of like apprenticeship finishing school for lawyers. And what I'm kind of hoping to talk about today is the fundamental neutral constitutional principles that I think matter and I think lawyers should be talking about, and how disappointed I am kind of in my profession, because most of the pundits you see on TV they almost treat politics like their client. They're coming out there and they're arguing for a side, and I'm not sure that's that helpful. And the segue to that is those are the principles that caused me to leave the Democratic Party during the Biden administration and register as an independent. And those are the principles that lead me to have some optimism about the next 4 years, which I think is a dramatic departure from your position, if I understand
wow, that
it
took a
correctly.
wild turn halfway through that explanation.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a particular topic you'd like to start with, or?
Sure. Maybe the starting point might be a background piece, if you'll indulge me for like 1 second.
Yeah, we'll indulge you for as long as you want, yeah.
Awesome. So I got brought up like a Clinton Democrat, and that was the way I approached politics, and it was a team sport. It was a vibe thing. I didn't really care, but I knew who my team was. And I went to law school, and by the way, I took it seriously. Like, it wasn't like I wasn't living it out. I went to Teach for America. I was teaching underprivileged kids. That's kind of what I was doing in my life. But when I went to law school, I was stunned as I started reading these books by the realization that I'm an originalist. Like, I'm reading these theories, and I've never before seen the principled case for originalism. I've never seen the principled case for conservatism. I'm not a conservative. I register as an independent, but that was the starting point. That stuck with me. And then when you saw what happened, and maybe this was happening before in the Trump years, the Obama years, but I wasn't aware of it. But in the Biden administration, you saw what I would call a radical departure from the kind of like constitutional principles and core democratic values that at least I thought I grew up with. And it wasn't my party anymore.
What do you think are a couple of those radical departures? I'm curious.
Sure. There were a few. We can take them in no particular order. We'll start with one that I think we agree with. The way, one of the big turning points for me was the Kenosha Rittenhouse stuff, because, Biden tweeted what he tweeted, and there was a kind of an implication that this was a white supremacist. And I believed it. Maybe I'm a sucker, but I legitimately thought this kid was a white supremacist who crossed state lines with an illegal firearm and shot black people. That was the information I believed when I started watching the trial every day from home.
Okay.
And
just as a quick thing, what you're talking about that Biden tweeted, wasn't this just it was like a 1.5-minute ad campaign video?
Yeah,
and I think Rittenhouse.
Yeah,
okay.
And he didn't say any of that, but it was run within the media sphere, right?
Okay.
And so then I believed those things. I was really wrong. And I'm watching this trial, and I have a law degree by this point. I'm like, oh my God, this kid, this is an easy case. This kid's going to be acquitted. There's no question. And he was. And then afterwards, Kamala Harris has a statement where she says, basically, when she was a prosecutor, she brought equity to the administration of justice. And this verdict shows that we have a long way to go. What does that mean? What do you think? What do you mean? What do you mean he was acquitted for self-defense, and that means that equity has a long way to go?
I would have to. I don't even remember her statement because I didn't care as much about her back then. But I would say it's probably a statement I'd be disappointed in. Sure.
No one did. No one cared about her that much back then. She was somebody who, and this is maybe another point that we might disagree on this one. I don't know if we do. She was selected, and she was selected openly with the idea that he's going to pick specifically a woman of color. Now, I don't think I'm not making an argument that she's unqualified by any stretch. What I'm saying is, if you're saying up front that one of your guiding criteria is sex and race, that violates a neutral principle.
Does it?
Yeah, for sure.
For a popularity contest?
Yeah.
Do you think that when Trump chose Pence because he was an evangelical white guy, do you think that like violated, like he was always going to choose somebody that was going to show up the evangelicals? Is that like a bad thing to choose him for his religion?
I think there's a very big difference between making it a campaign promise and making it and saying to someone, I'm picking you for this reason, and then doing it versus pick the best person. I think we all know how this works. I'm not going to disagree with you about that.
Well, because there might be an area where we agree on some other things, but you'd say pick the best person. The best person might literally be somebody that shores up that weakness, and that weakness might be demographic, right?
But when you announce it that way, when you make the criteria public that way, you are lessening this person.
I super disagree.
You're injuring them.
How?
Because, did you see how this election played out?
Did you see how 2020 played out when she was the VP and she won with Biden? I mean, what do you mean?
I mean, she won, and then she ran in 2024,
and then she lost.
It was a bit of a disaster, and one of the problems was people remembered how she was picked.
You don't
not
even
think
remotely
that was a live issue in the election?
No, definitely not.
Oh,
but I mean, like I'm just saying that there might be ways where I could agree with this, but
he was going to pick Susan Rice first.
Sure, but I'm like, elections are to some extent popularity contests, in that like you have to win the vote, right? Yeah. And if I know that constituents are looking for certain things, even protected classes or non-meritorious classes or whatever, there's probably, I think that people view qualifications for jobs as like this straight line, when in reality it's like buckets. Like there's a lot of people that would be qualified for said positions, and if you could choose something that's going to help you more in an election, then that makes sense. I don't think saying that like I want to choose somebody who is black because they represent this part of my constituents makes those constituents think, oh my God, you're pandering, or you chose this person, now you devalue them. It's like, oh, okay, I feel like I'm hurt a little bit more because at least there's somebody that represents like this part of the constituency.
Let's look at it the other way.
Sure.
You make a campaign promise, right? Like, for example, Justice Jackson, who, by the way, again, qualified. But if you say, if I'm elected, I will nominate a woman of color to the Supreme Court. Who are you making that campaign promise to?
The people who are voting for you?
But you're making a campaign promise to interest groups on the basis of race and gender. It's openly racist. If you are going to talk about fundamental neutral principles, what do you believe in? What do you think that these are distinctions that we just shouldn't be drawing in that way? But
they're already drawn that way. I think that's the issue, right? You can't step into a world and pretend that we can be fundamentally neutral and that there haven't already been lines that have been aggressively drawn and are impacting who shows up where, right?
And this is the big distinction. And I think this is where the left lost me. Because I think there's tons of room for what's described as equity, which is the idea that, like, if you think about the way society's structured, we have constitutional principles and we're all supposed to live by those. And then on top of those, we're stacking modern principles. And you can make society better. You can recognize, even if have, let's say, equality of opportunity, or we're being fair about the Constitution, there are people who are still being left behind. And we want to do something about them. We want to help. I mean, this is literally why I joined Teach for America, right? It's for exactly this reason. So I'm sympathetic, really sympathetic. But the fact that you want to help is not a justification for violating the constitutional principles and the norms that come with that. The culture of saying, well, you know what? We shouldn't judge people by their skin color or their race or their sex. We should judge them by their character, their accomplishments, their merits. And if you take that seriously, then what you would need to do is find a way to help without violating the principle.
Sure. So I think that the issue that you run into is when you pretend, or I don't want to say pretend, that's loaded, but when you say like we ought to adhere to certain principles of neutrality, I think that is commendable, but only in an environment where those principles have been adhered to. Let's say theoretically, we want to pick the person who is, I want the 10 most intelligent people on my team, okay? The 10 with the highest degrees, okay? And let's say that I go into a world and I've got 50 X's and I've got 50 Y's. Let's say that 5 years ago, the 50 X's, just by virtue of being X's, were given $1 million, and then the 50 Y's, by virtue of being Y's, weren't given anything. And then now 5 years later, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to be colorblind, I'm going to be background blind, I'm going to be poverty blind. I'm just going to choose what I think is the best for the job, and I end up choosing all X's. I think that people would look at that world and they go, well, hold on. I understand that you're being neutral now, but the composition that you have now, by calling it neutral, is implying something far more insidious than even the reverse racist person would be by saying, I'm going to strive for a bit more equity. Because the implication, I was like, I guess the X's are just way more qualified because they're the ones who are, have the most degrees or whatever here. But like the reality is we lived in a time where it wasn't neutral, and that is explaining at least some of the divide. And I think that we kind of have to work to like rectify that going forward.
I don't think I disagree with anything you're saying, but I mean, this is basically the Harvard affirmative action case, right? Where there's all kinds of realities in our society, all kinds of realities in our history. And I mean, for those of you who are lawyers or are going to go to law school, if you open up a con law textbook and you start learning constitutional law, it is in many ways the history of American racism. That's kind of the core subject matter. So there's no question that what you're saying is true. The question is, what can you do and can you not do to mitigate those harms without violating your principles?
Sure.
So, like, for example, in the Harvard case, which I thought the court got right, I thought the court got it right because on a fundamental level, if you're worried about fundamental neutral principles, the phrase, there are too many Asians in Harvard, should chill you to the bone. Like that is gross. It's a thing that should upset you. Now, are there ways to solve racial inequities? Yes, but in a zero-sum setting, like an admission standard, probably not.
When you say that, because there's a game being played here where we pretend that's like a very racist statement. When somebody says there are too many Asians at Harvard, what is the underlying aspect of that statement? Why would what do you think is driving a person to that utterance?
Do you want me to give the steel man position, or do you want to?
What do you think is actually true?
I think that, and I think that people have taken diversity, equity, and inclusion as a moral prerogative that is self-justifying. Meaning, like, we all know it's good, and because we all know it's good, things done in service of it are automatically good, and that we don't need to think about it much more than that.
Okay. Okay.
I'm not somebody who's going to say it's always bad. That's not my thing.
And honestly, I don't even know. I'm not a big affirmative action person, so I didn't care much about the outcome there, because I think places like California had already gotten rid of affirmative action for schools, for colleges, because of issues. So I'm not a big affirmative action defender. But this is an important thing, because I think there's a false equivalency being drawn here between the racism of saying, a person saying this school needs to be all white versus this school has too many Asians. I think the person that's saying this school needs to be all white is a person who's saying, historically, black people don't belong here, because there's like a racial supremacy going on. When somebody says this school has too many Asians, and I might not agree with the analysis, but I think when they're saying it, this school has too many Asians, what they're saying is the only way this many people who are qualifying for the school, the only way that they can be so Asian is if there's some other problem with society that hasn't been rectified, because it shouldn't just be Asian people that can qualify into Harvard. Now, whether you agree with the analysis or not, and I think there's a lot lacking there, I don't think it comes from like a racist place the same way that a person saying this school should have no black people or no whatever non-white people, whatever. I think it comes from different places.
I think it's both racist. It's just racism is not equivalent, right? Like I'm like, this is not the kind of racism that I would say is equivalent to like the KKK, right? Like it can be better or worse.
Sure, I'm not saying better or worse. I'm just saying it comes from a different place.
Well, I think let me give you an example of kind of what I think would be a more appropriate solution. And I'm going to give you the example because it's like near and dear to my heart, which is I graduated and I was super motivated by what I perceived as racial injustice. And back then we called it the education gap. Now it would be social justice, or the terms have changed. And I was, a recent graduate, and I'm thinking, what can I do? What is my impact? And the decision to join Teach for America was because it's exactly this conversation. I was thinking, well, okay, I want to make a difference. I don't want it to be in a zero-sum way. I want to actually find people and help. And what can I do? I can make education better. That doesn't detract from anybody else. It just makes it better for the people who receive it. And then I was thinking, okay, well, if I teach high school, well, then I'm going to be teaching kids who already have these deficits from bad schools for all these years. That's going to minimize my impact. So I'm going to teach elementary school. I'm going to try to get kids before they have a reading gap and get them on track, get them ahead, do what I can. I mean, why I left is another story, but that's an example, by the way, of the type of solution that doesn't run into these problems. And it's not the only one. There's many ways to do this, but if you
Sure, I don't
if you attack the solution at the level of like college admissions, you're going to run into these problems.
Sure. I mean, in my opinion, the solution kind of has to be hit from all angles. It's one of the reasons why so many societal things are difficult to deal with, is because it's not just one thing that you can fix. For instance, we'll do the stereotypical like black family problem, right? That kids are doing bad in school, sometimes because they come from single-parent households. Well, how do you fix a single-parent household? Well, doing things relating to contraception or keeping families together or not having black men living in areas where they're prone to commit more crime or whatever, to be in jail. But how do you keep people from being in poor areas? Well, make sure that they have better jobs, which helps if they come from better families, and they're not committing crime, so they're not going to jail, which would help with their debt. Like it's like this huge cyclical thing. So it has to be like this push where it's like, maybe nonviolent drug offenders don't need to be in jail all the time. And maybe there should be like school lunch provided so that if you are from a rough family, like you are always going to like, it's like a thing that has to be hit from all angles. There has to be,
I think we agree on this.
Sure,
School lunch is a great example. Like just providing meals to kids who otherwise won't have them has an enormous impact on their performance in school, minimally, probably just their life in general.
Sure.
And does nothing really to detract from any benefits given to anyone else in the whole country, other than if you want to make some kind of like diffused spending argument, which is
although I do think it hurts that, so the only reason I bring this up is just to put a cap on that final point. I do think that there are different motivations for people that are looking at certain areas that are heavily overrepresented in certain races versus like just the traditional old, racist people. We can say that both are problematic, but I think they're different in kind. And then the second thing is, if we're talking about how there are ways to address, not to use a triggering word, I'll say inequities between classes, right? Poor people, rich people, it doesn't have to be races. But if there are ways to address them, one of the games that I find that conservatives play all the time is, we don't need affirmative action. We should be helping poor people instead. And then it's like, okay, fine. Let's get rid of affirmative action. Now we can help poor people? No. Okay, because the people that block school lunches state after state after state, it's always conservatives. It's always conservatives. So where are they willing to give on any area? If we get rid of affirmative action, they'll say the same thing about Ukraine. We need to stop supporting Ukraine so we can help our own people. Where do we vote for this at? Like, all you talk about is cut, 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 cut. Like, where is this happening?
Yeah, and I think this is a place where Pisco and I got in an argument about this recently. So, no offense, Pisco. I think that the legal profession is doing itself a disservice, because if you go and you look at the media landscape right now, you'll find nothing but lawyers who are arguing passionately for partisan issues, which is, I mean, fine, make a living. It comes up a lot. It's interesting content. No, there's no harm in that from that perspective, I guess. But it runs into this problem that lawyers, fundamentally, the nature of our work, like when I went to law school, one of the first things they taught us, they said, never, when you're in court, never say, in my opinion. Because the judge is going to say, well, you're paid to have that opinion. That is your, that's not it's not even your opinion. It's your client's opinion. Like, of course, that's your opinion. Who cares? When your politics are your client, you're coming out there and you're advocating. You're probably doing a great job. But what you're not doing is talking to the public about what is fundamentally neutral, what is constitutional, what a constitutional society would look like, what federalism looks like. And it turns into kind of what you're talking about right now, which is a back and forth about which party is doing which. And, like my interest in defending conservatives for not wanting to do school lunches is zero. It sounds like a terrible policy to me. I'm sure there's some details that we could get into, but the fact that a conservative would want to do it shouldn't influence my view, because why would the fact that it's a conservative talking point make it a better or worse idea?
Because you said that you moved from Democrat to independent, implying that one side is getting something more wrong, or I don't know if you're like continuing that journey over to the conservative side. You're saying conservatism, but I don't know if you mean that in a political sense or just conserving like constitutional values, or if...
Well, this is a tricky...
wait, and then also wait, before you answer that, I'm just curious, did it bother you equally? So you said it was a big deal when Biden said that he was going to pick... I think for Jackson, I think he said he was going to pick a black woman in Supreme Court. Did it bother you when Trump said, because didn't Trump say that he was going to replace RGB with a woman? Isn't that where Amy came from?
I don't know if he said that. If he did, it would bother me.
Okay.
We can look it up. I don't know the answer.
Okay. Can I get a quick fact check from the back there? Did he say that?
I don't know. I'll check it.
Fuck you.
That was like a mouthful of food too.
Okay.
Very professional. But I mean, so this is kind of the weird posture of this conversation, right? Like, I am very interested in defending originalism. I'm very interested, and part of my optimism about a next Trump presidency is that originalism was in many senses on the ballot, and that's something that I'm pleased about. But like, if we're talking about fundamentally neutral principles, the peaceful transfer of power is like very high on that list.
Okay.
So, like, did I vote for the guy? No. Why not? Because he was disqualified because of the false slates of electors. Like, like if you're intellectually honest about these principles, you're not going to get them right all the time, but the outcomes make sense.
The day after RGB died, Trump said that he would pick a woman, that it's going to be a woman.
Yeah, that does sound like him.
He told the hearing crowd. A very talented, very brilliant woman.
Well, and it turned out she is a very talented, very brilliant woman, but he should have said that.
What does originalism mean to you?
Originalism means that, if you indulge me in like the shortest of stories.
Go for it.
It's like a law. It's one of the old law students talk about, or you get told by professors. So there's two legends of the early American law, Learned Hand and Oliver Wendell Holmes, and they're having some interaction and they're parting company. And Learned Hand says, as they depart, he kind of wants to needle Holmes. So he says, "Do justice, sir, do justice." And Holmes is infuriated, chases him down and says like, "No, that's not what I do. I interpret the law." That's the distinction. There's originalism is the idea that what lawyers do is we interpret legal documents with legal reasoning. And our job is to figure out what was meant and what it was understood to mean at the time it was drafted. That's our job, and we try to do it as well as we can.
For just real quick, lawyers or judges when you say
lawyers,
this? Or
judges are lawyers.
Sure. Or I'm thinking, because I feel like there's a slightly different role when I think of like litigants versus judges.
Oh yeah, like if you hire me to be your lawyer, I'm going to have whatever position is helpful
I don't
for
want you to say that like, well, I think that the law is probably against you here. I want you to say we're going to make the other side argue this as well as possible.
But that's why we have an adversarial system, because you get two of those and it gets canceled out, right?
Okay, yeah.
But and if that's the originalist view, and the originalist looks at the structure of the Constitution and they say, we have a legislature and they create law. We have an executive and he takes care to enforce law. We have a judiciary and they interpret law. And everyone should be doing what they're supposed to be doing. We want to keep them inside their zones. We don't want them encroaching on each other's territory. We want to preserve this balance of power, and we want to preserve, most importantly, these roles. And there's an understanding there that people are inherently flawed and make mistakes, but the best way that humans have come up to mitigate that is through sound institutions and people playing a role. They're taking a fiduciary duty. They're being a judge. That's how you correct for it. It's the best way.
Yeah.
The other approach, the living constitutionalist, says
the thing that Roberts and all them currently believe in, right?
No, Roberts. No. What they say is, well, shouldn't the judge look at the Constitution and say, well, this isn't just any document. This is the Constitution. It's a living document. We should interpret it in our best judgment. And aren't we reasonable and wise and appointed to the court because of our wisdom? And we're going to infer from it new things in light of our understanding of today and announce new and wonderful rights.
This is the Roberts, Alito, and all of them guys, right?
No, not at all.
Really? Which part of the Constitution do the three core actions, official acts and unofficial acts, where does that come from?
You want to do immunity?
I guess I just don't understand. It feels like these guys are one of the issues that I have as a legal retard, because I don't have the scholarship or whatever, but so I'm familiar with this concept of originalism. I feel like there's a phrase I've read over and over again that means sometimes everything and sometimes nothing, is when the text is clear and unambiguous. And then you've got the breathing document people, the penumbra of rights for Roe and Casey, and the crazy interpretations to make things adaptable to the modern day. I feel like people are originalists when it suits them, and then when it doesn't suit them, all of a sudden the Constitution is the most biologically alive thing ever. And I guess the two cases that I'd be interested in is it would be the immunity one, and then it would be the 14th Amendment, the Section 3, the Colorado one. Because I feel like, we can start with the immunity one.
Sure. And just before we get into it, like, there's no ideology or doctrine that prevents people from being wrong or corrupt. Or, like, it's a school of thought, right?
Of course, yeah.
So there's always going to be a separate level of analysis about whether the individuals are doing the right thing. But when you look at, like, in my notes, I've kind of forgot the name. It was Texas v. Johnson. It was a Scalia case. He was the fifth vote, and he voted that you have a free speech right to burn your own flag. Do you think Scalia was leaping for joy over that. I mean, I know he's not. He gave remarks on it constantly. He would prefer that you could jail someone for burning their own flag.
Okay.
But that's not what the Constitution says.
Okay.
Right. So that's the idea there, that like originalism requires of you to look at the Constitution and figure out what it means, even if it is different than you would otherwise prefer, which is tough because if the alternative is I use my reasoned judgment, it's going to turn out the Constitution basically always says what you thought it said. You wake up in the morning, you go, God, does the Constitution give me this new right? Oh, why, yes, it does. What a coincidence. Amazing. I must be a brilliant mind. And there's a real risk there of the judiciary just reaching out and taking power from everybody else, because people think of rights as this wonderful, beautiful thing, and they often can be. But what they really are things removed from the democratic process. When you give a right, what you're really saying is people are not allowed to vote on this. It's decided.
Okay.
And do we really want 9 unelected judges being in charge of creating new rights because they think it sounds good? That's
feels like you're describing the immunity thing a lot to me for all of this stuff.
So let's do immunity.
Okay.
So what's your problem with the decision?
I don't think there's certainly no textual reading of the Constitution that gets us criminal immunity. I don't think there's anything rooted in history. I would say the history is very contrary to a king above laws. I think that the citations to Nixon v. Fitzgerald are probably some of the worst I've ever seen in my entire life. Roberts quoting half sentences in order to, out of whole cloth, fabricate these new buckets of activity. I don't think there's. Yeah, I guess my issue is there's no source in law, there's no source in history, and it just seems to be a wholesale new creation of a thing to protect Trump to basically be an infinite criminal if he so chooses to be. So
the other, Nixon was one of the big cases that they cited. The other was Youngstown Steel. Do you know that one?
I'm not as familiar with Youngstown.
Yeah, so I'm going to get the history wrong, but it was the Korean War, and basically the president was attempting to seize the steel industry. Okay. And the question was, does the president in an emergency have this kind of power?
Sure.
And it's a nightmare case that's often given to torture 1Ls in law school because it has I forgot the number, it's like 5 or 6 concurring opinions. Okay. And trying to figure out what the holding is impossible because you have to read them all and figure out what they agree on. But Justice Jackson wrote the concurrence that actually matters. And what he said is, when you look at the president's power, you have to go through an analysis of saying, first, is the president doing something the Constitution says he has the power to do? If so, he has the power to do it. There's nothing to talk about, right? That's his power. Other than that, the president has power that's granted to him by Congress, by law. Okay, so then you ask, does Congress support the action? If yes, he has more power, but less than if it was a constitutional power. And if Congress passed a law, but Congress doesn't like what he's doing, he has less power. And you can analyze the scope of the president's power by looking at his relation to the Constitution and what Congress is doing in the laws that have been passed.
When was that case decided?
Oh, I don't remember off the top of my head.
Was it before or after Nixon v. Fitzgerald?
This is Korean War, so I don't have.
Okay, yeah, so this would have been before. Okay. Yeah. So then I'll say, without having read that, because I don't want to get trapped by you giving me interpretation that's true. But I will say that despite that,
nothing but good faith.
Even afterwards, it still seems to be the case that after Youngstown, in the close shadow of Youngstown, it was still the assumption that the president could be criminally charged with committing crimes.
Well, this is in law. There's this thing where sometimes it's dangerous to ask questions you don't want answers to. Okay. This is the advice I would have given the lawyers who brought the recent trans rights case to the Supreme Court. Okay. Which is do you really want this Supreme Court to answer that question?
Sure. I think Disney asked this question when it came time to defend against the Trump defamation case, yeah?
Yeah.
I guess about the sexual side, yeah.
So in terms of how Youngstown matters for the immunity, which is I think what we're talking about, the first question that the court asked was, what happens when the president is doing something within his core exclusive constitutional purview? Right? The best, clearest example is pardons. Sure. The president has the power to issue a pardon. Okay. Does Congress have the power to make that criminal?
Not if it's in the Constitution, not without an amendment, right?
Yeah, not at all. But they also can't make it criminal sideways. They can't pass a law that says you aren't allowed to do business in the government on Wednesdays under penalty of criminal law, and then the president signs a pardon on Wednesday and say, oh, well, that wasn't about pardons, but you violated it, you go to jail. He's immune. The reason he's immune is Congress has no power to regulate his pardon. So to the extent their law is regulating his pardon, they don't have that power. It's exclusively his. Does that make sense?
I just totally disagree.
On
I
what
would
basis?
agree that like if it was a law that was targeted in a way to try to restrict the power of the president in some way like that, then sure. But it can't be that it can't just be that there's no way to touch a particular criminal act just because it's associated with a presidential power.
Well, the Congress only has the powers given to them by the Constitution. They don't have other powers. So if a power is exclusively given to the president, that's the president's sphere. That's where.
Sure, but let's say the president goes up to a man and says, "I'll pardon you if you go and you murder 20 people." By this new ruling, that is untouchable. Because we would say, well, holding him criminally accountable for this conspiracy to commit murder or, directing somebody to commit murder or whatever, we would say that, well, that's part of his pardon power. That's insane.
I don't think that's untouchable.
Okay. I mean, Roberts would disagree with you.
No, this is going to get in the weeds on a point that maybe is.
Well, let's get in the weeds. You're a lawyer, and I've read the case, and for sure. So go ahead.
So the pardon aspect of that is untouchable. Saying, I want you to murder 20 people is not an official act.
Well, yeah, but how can I even probe that?
So
because remember, Roberts said we can't even look at the motivations for an official act because that would breach the whole point of having those things be.
So you can't look at the motivations for the pardon, but you could look at the motivations for saying, I want you to murder 20 people.
Yeah, but how would I even begin that investigation when it's attached to the pardon? And just to be clear, Sotomayor in her dissent brought up that Navy SEALs thing, that the president could order Navy SEALs to kill a political rival, and Roberts didn't touch that in his
We're going to have
opinion.
to be really careful with our examples because one of the things that happens in this analysis is whenever you change the hypothetical, it changes the presidential power at issue.
Sure, I agree.
My answer is going to change.
Okay.
Right? So
in regards to the pardon thing, I guess the only reason I bring up the pardon thing is because it came up in oral arguments as well.
it's like the clearest example, which is why
I believe the analogy that they used was a one-legged stool. Right? That trying to convict the president for taking a bribe for a pardon is like trying to sit on a one-legged stool, and that you can't look at the pardon and then you can't look at the motivation for the pardon. So what is a bribe besides the president just accepting money, right?
So this was Justice Barrett's concurrence, which I think she got right. I think that her opinion was better than the majority opinion.
It always is.
Actually, she's been very good. But her view was that the evidentiary question, whether you can use evidence of official acts, didn't need to be decided.
For sure.
And it didn't. Like, because there's presidential immunity, it wasn't really before the court. It didn't have to be decided right there. And I think that her example was bribery. It's a good one where it's, okay, it's very hard to prove bribery if you can't talk about the official act. Here,
this
the
is
pardon.
the one-legged stool thing. You can't, And then Roberts had an annotation in his opinion where he was like, you could see a public record of the pardon. And so you could, but I don't even know what that means.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could see public. You could, in a bribery case, for example, you could say, we have evidence of him saying, if you give me $1 million, I will pardon you.
Well, I think the evidence had to be,
and we have evidence of the pardon itself, like the public record of the pardon. It would be very hard to charge it would be a challenging case to bring because of that. One thing that I'm not 100% sure on, and I might be overreading the opinion, they do talk about evidence to the jury. So it is possible that that decision still allows you to give the evidence to the judge if the jury doesn't see it, which might matter because that can help you divide up the case.
I don't think that, because you're not even allowed, you wouldn't even have that evidence because all of this can be done on interlocutory appeal before the case even gets in front of a judge, before you even do evidentiary
well, not
stuff.
before it gets in front of a judge.
I'm sorry, before you're doing like your evidentiary hearings, before you're like in like a trial setting or whatever. So you wouldn't even have that evidence because you wouldn't be able to, because by the time you go to investigate it, then they could immediately say, sorry, we're throwing up this here, we're throwing up that here.
It's not entirely clear to me how, and first of all, I really hope it never becomes clear to me, because if we could go another 250 years without having a presidential prosecution case, that would be great.
It would be really great if we could go another 250 years without having a president committing blatant federal crimes as well.
I think that's true. I also think that there's like a reason that Nixon was pardoned. And the reason is this sort of constitutional, like this is really heavy constitutional friction. This is like bordering on constitutional crisis level friction, right? It forces answers that we might have preferred we didn't have. I think sometimes you're better off trying to revert to soft power and norms and not having like a hard legal answer. Because when you get a hard legal answer, it's going to be precise. And then we're talking about this evidentiary rule, and that can be tricky. Like I'm not exactly sure how that's going to be interpreted in the future.
I disagree. I don't like this line of thinking. Here's my issue. Okay, that when Roberts cites Fitzgerald, he uses Fitzgerald to bring up that quote of he quotes the end of a sentence where he says something about how we can't basically prevent the function of the executive to carry out its role, right? That was an important part of that holding. But he misses the first part of that sentence where they talk about like on balance of like the interest to society, we wouldn't want to do something to the president that would inhibit their ability to perform their role as the executive. And while I agree that we wouldn't want to live in a world where every single action is being second guessed or whatever, we also don't want to live in a world, for some reason, the balance is always missing when we're talking about the criminal stuff. Like we have we have a big interest in not having a criminal president. And for some reason, that's totally devoid of being addressed at all in
Don't elect
Roberts.
one.
What?
Don't elect one.
That's not an answer, though.
It is the answer.
So should we have no constitutional limits on who should be president?
I'm not sure how that follows.
Well, like, why do we have a constitutional limit on the age or on two, like, not serving more than 2 terms? Like, well, just don't elect a guy who's too young, or don't elect somebody who's had multiple terms. Like, we have these restrictions that exist in law for a reason. Just because you've won an election, especially if you've used crimes to win the election, is not somehow a vindication of yourself in front of a criminal court. Right? No king shall be above the law. I just don't understand why we would say, well, if they won the election, then they must not have committed any crimes.
The answer to the first question is those restrictions, those limitations exist because they were in the founding documents ratified by the states. So that's why they're there. If there had been a felony ban, we would have one, but there isn't. So the answer is, unfortunately, the law is what the law is. So I'm not sure what the point there is.
Well, what I'm saying is, when you said just don't elect them,
don't elect them.
But that's not when you vote for somebody, we're not voting on whether or not, we don't vote on whether or not people should be criminally prosecuted or whether or not somebody's committed a crime.
No, but people knew that Donald Trump had this felony conviction. They voted for him.
But that has nothing to do with the criminal process.
The fact that he has a felony conviction has nothing to do with the criminal process? I'm not following you.
The fact that people vote for somebody has nothing to do with whether or not you've committed a crime or not.
Yeah, but I mean, I think he was convicted of a crime.
None of the federal ones.
None of the federal ones, no. But he was convicted of a crime, so there he has whatever the 34 counts. There's a felony, and people voted for him anyway. In fact, I think if I recall correctly, though this is not my area, DeSantis was actually doing pretty well for a while, and around the time of the prosecution started is when Trump just like totally pulled ahead. So take from that what you will, but if that's my recollection, I don't know. This is more your area.
But this, as somebody who just opened this, saying how we should be worried about the law, not in necessarily a politically partisan sense, but rather like law for the sake of law. It shouldn't matter whether he's performing better or worse as a result of prosecution. Ideally, we'd follow the law where the law goes, right?
Yeah.
I just don't understand why we would say that if you vote for somebody, then they're vindicated in criminal court. These two things should have no attachment to each other whatsoever.
I'm not saying that if you vote for someone, they're vindicating criminal court. I'm saying that if you don't want someone with a felony record to be president, you shouldn't vote for someone with a felony record.
I agree, but we're not talking about who I want for president. We're talking about whether or not somebody should be held liable for committing a crime. The Americans can vote for a person who's convicted if they want, but we're not talking about if they should be able to vote for him. We're talking about, did he commit a crime and should he be held liable for those crimes? But the Supreme Court has decided that the president, when he's the president, is not held liable for committing crimes anymore, as long as they're in some way connected to any kind of official act.
If they're within his core capacity, which is what we were talking about, then Congress has no power to criminalize them. So there's no way that it could be a crime. And then if it's outside of that, if it's in the outer boundaries of his official capacities, they have the rebuttable presumption, and we'll see how that plays out if there's more cases, because we don't really know, because the cases were terminated before. Pisco might know. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure they never got to that stage in any of the prosecution, so we don't actually know what's gonna come of that down the road.
Yeah, but so what we've done is we've taken. So I mean, like the best example is Roberts in his worthy, admirable goal of defending his favorite president, when he remanded those actions back to the lower courts for them to go through like these tests to represent the cases, he took one act and he declared it as an untouchable act, which I believe Amy also took issue with, where she doesn't know why he analyzed this act. And that's when he talked about the whole issue that happened inside of the DOJ, where Donald Trump was telling his heads, he's going to fire you guys, he's going to put in Jeffrey Clark, he's going to make him send out a false letter. And it was like, well, hold on. All of that counts as an official act. I think this is the thing. Him bucketing that action is one of the things that makes me look sideways because at this whole ruling, because I think there was a world where attorneys or legal people or like people reading this decision can go like, okay, it sounds bad, but we have to see how it will play out. Because there's a world where maybe like, what counts as an official act versus core power, like there's a world where it's okay. And I maybe would have agreed with that, or at least I could at least be warm to that argument. But to see him take all of that off the table, it's like, well, hold on. If we can take that off the table, then why can we not have the bribe situation with a pardon or the SEAL Team 6 example or any other number of crazy acts as long as they're in some way tied to an official power?
Well, going back to what we were talking about before, and I understand we disagree about the core powers analysis, but understanding that that's where the court was coming from, right? So they're asking what's a core power, what's not a core power, right?
Sure.
Okay, we disagree, I get that.
But what do you mean by we disagree here?
Well, I think that it made sense to say that Congress can't criminalize a core power because it's exclusively granted to the president.
That is true, but that wasn't the question before the court. We already know that's the case. Congress can't already do that. There's nothing unique being said there.
That was their logic. When they were asking, is there criminal immunity at all? That was their logic. They went through the core powers question, right? So
sure, but we've already. I mean, like this is not. Nobody's ever thought this. Like Congress can't say it is illegal for the president to pardon somebody. That wouldn't even make it through the first level court challenge.
And they also can't say, to my example earlier, no federal activity can be done on Wednesdays. And if the president pardons on Wednesday, they can't send him to jail for it.
Sure, potentially, yeah. But the question is anything ostensibly even connected to a core power of criminal act?
If we take that as established, which I know you might disagree with, but if we understand that's the logic of the court, their next,
I would agree with that. Yeah. That's established, yeah.
Their next question is, well, what of these charges touches a core exclusive power? Take care to enforce the law is a core exclusive power, right? So he's talking to his agency staff. He's talking to the people that enforce the law on his behalf as part of the executive branch. That's a core and exclusive power. The examples they gave that were of things that were not a core and exclusive power, like what is the president's role in calling Arizona or calling Georgia and asking for votes, right? That has nothing to do with the president's core and exclusive powers. So those ones were remanded because that's not within his core powers.
No, but it still gets presumptively immune.
It gets a presumption. Yeah.
Sure. So that means that the government, the prosecution, has to prove that probing on those acts will in no way inhibit the executive branch, which who knows what the burden is for that to overcome. But
we don't know.
Yeah, we don't. But then the fact that...
And hopefully we never find out, yeah.
Like, do you think it's a core power of the presidency for the president to be able to condition his hiring or firing of a cabinet-level position on any act that he wants? Like, could the president say, William Barr, unless you go and, kill 5 school children, I'm going to fire you as my DOJ head? Could the president... Because under this current ruling, my argument would be he can absolutely do that, and it would be untouchable.
I think the president has... I don't think there are any limitations on his ability to remove his senior officers.
But I'm asking, but it's not whether or not he can remove them, it's whether or not he could be investigated for a crime.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, according to the new ruling, he would never be investigated for a crime in connection with a hiring or firing.
Well, this gets back to the evidentiary question, but because this is why I was asking about the question I was saying earlier about can this go to the judge or does it or is it totally barred? Matters, right? Because if in the example you gave, you said if you don't go murder these school children, I'm going to fire you. And if we parse that sentence, we could say if you don't murder school children, that's unofficial. There's nothing official about that. I will fire you. Clearly official.
But it would be, these are tied together. Let's say the president creates in the White House the presidential room of interviews, where I interview you to see if I want to nominate you for a position. You come in, everything in that conversation is about hiring and firing, which is a core conclusive and preclusive power of the president. So how could you even reach into that room to ask any questions?
And this is why this is why I think the evidentiary issue matters, and why the judge-jury distinction might matter, which I'm less sure about. Let's for a moment assume that the evidence you're allowed to give the evidence to the judge, but not the jury.
But the thing is, I don't know how you would get because this is about even investigating it. We can't even ask for the motivations, right?
Well, you can't ask for the motivations, but
so how would I even know? How would I even have any probable cause for
immunity? Doesn't have anything to do with investigations. You can investigate
You
something
would
without
think
bringing charges.
that, but I think that even for stuff like subpoenas or anything else, I don't think you're allowed, because you wouldn't be allowed to ask about those actions at all.
There's going to be litigation around it. There's going to be really serious challenges. So let's say you want to investigate this, and in this hypothetical, and again, I'm not sure what the rule is here, but if the rule is you can give it to the judge but not the jury, right? Then you could gather evidence, submit it under seal, and say, Judge, I'd like you to parse this. I'd like for you to try to figure out which pieces we can use, which pieces we can't use, and then we can try to divvy it up. If the rule is you can't use it at all, then you can't do that. And in that case, Justice Barrett's really well-reasoned concurrence becomes critically important.
Yeah, because it's insane. Yeah, and I would agree with you. That would be insane. But
I've just through my plug, I have an article on X about this because her concurrence really will, in that scenario, it really will matter.
Yeah,
and hopefully it would become the majority over time.
Sure. Yeah, because my issue is just that the problem is Roberts' rationale for taking the motivations or for using an act to prove another thing off the table. Roberts said, well, if there's going to be any immunity granted, if we allow people to investigate or use these actions as evidence for other bad things, well, that would defeat the whole purpose of the immunity. I would imagine that would very easily and quickly spill over to I'm almost positive that as written, you can't subpoena and do investigations into official acts and then give it to the judge and then they decide. I don't think you can touch them. You can't go anywhere at all. If you were to subpoena or do anything, I think you could block that. You could get an injunction or a TRO just on the virtue of the presidential immunity ruling.
Well, subpoenas and investigations are pretty different, right? So with a subpoena, you would have litigation over whether or not the court's going to allow you to do this. An investigation, that's just, okay, people are knocking on doors, making phone calls, figuring out what happened. The court's not even involved at that stage.
If you're a criminal body and you're doing investigation stuff, don't you have to be
like the FBI? You mean?
Yeah. Or a police officer. It's not. Don't you need at least some kind of reasonable suspicion to begin?
Yeah, but the judge isn't really involved in that unless you need a warrant.
Yeah, but if you're starting off your investigation there, you have to show that trail by the time you get to the judge, right? Couldn't you just fruit of the poison tree or whatever and say you started this, you're asking why he pardoned him. You can't even ask that question. This is all off the table.
I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think anyone knows the answer to that. That's a very novel legal theory, I'll say.
What is not? Well, I think that you're familiar with all of the behavior that Roberts bucketed about the DOJ, right?
Yeah.
None of that. I don't think any reasonable person would look at that and go yeah, this is probably what the president, the Constitution intended for him to tell his DOJ head that he needs to commit fraud and perjury to all of the states to win in the next election. So that's an official. I don't think anybody would think that.
Well,
right?
I think the problem is the motivations test, and this is different than the evidentiary issue, but the question, the part where they said you can't look into the motivations of the president, the problem is if you don't have that in there, the exception swallows the rule, right? Because then you can say, all right, let's say Trump takes office and Biden's told his DOJ to investigate all kinds of things over the course of his presidency. And then Trump says, well, you know what? That investigation, it was a sham. So even though he's immune, I say it's a sham. We are going to argue in court it's a sham, so we can bypass immunity, right? And we can go through what we can do. The exception is so broad that the whole purpose of immunity, and you see this in the qualified immunity context as well, is to prevent the litigation from going so far that it's incredibly onerous and burdensome and kind of ruins your life.
So I'm glad you brought this up because this was my feeling as well, is that this thing, I don't know if this was sort of I think it was also Amy that brought this up, Justice Barrett.
That concurrence was so good. It was really good.
It was okay, but it was written on the back of an insane ruling. So I think anything that was sobering there would have been good. But
well, I brought up Justice Jackson in Youngstown Steel, right? Obviously that was a plurality, not a majority, so it's a different context. But, sometimes a really good concurrence stands the test of time. And, down the road, we find that that's the one that people care about. But we'll see.
Sure.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Oh, the issue is, so one of the things that Justice Barrett brought up that I thought was good to bring up is one of the things that this ruling says is that the criminal justice system is not suited for political parties. Like parties to a case that are political in nature. It can never do it because they're going to be so biased, and that it undermines the entirety of our criminal justice system. And one of the things I think it was her that brought it up, or it was sort of my own her dissent, that people talk about frivolous litigation when it comes to civil matters, but criminal matters are not the same. You've got to go through a whole grand jury process. There's like a lot more stages involved here to make sure everybody's being a bit of a better actor than just a civil suit, which anybody can file for any fucking reason ever.
Yeah.
But to say that we don't trust criminal courts to litigate anything involving a presidential action, I think undermines the system so much that if you really think that a system could be so corrupt that they could bring a frivolous lawsuit through a grand jury, through the entirety of the DOJ, and then get a jury trial with the president and convict him, if you think that it's so corrupt that it could do that from start to finish, well, why wouldn't they just like go after unofficial acts or whatever and then just make some bullshit up and go after him there? Because at that point, you're basically at that issue anyway. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
I think so. I mean, I think there's the difference between civil and criminal is an important distinction. If only because anyone can bring a civil lawsuit. So the
penalties are a lot different too, right?
Yeah. Penalties are very different, and you could have hundreds of lawsuits, right? Because anyone can bring them.
Yeah.
So that has its own kind of crazy disincentive, which is what the Nixon case was about.
Yeah.
In the criminal context, there's less risk of truly frivolous suits than in the civil context, for sure. But as you were saying, the penalties are so different. And the demand on your attention and the prospect of just like ruining your life is so different. So they're not analogous.
But why is it that way? Why are the penalties so much more, and why is it so much more?
Why is criminal more severe than civil?
Yeah.
Because the state can send you to jail. They can.
Yeah, but why have we made those penalties more severe? Because we have a huge public interest in people not being criminals.
I mean, obviously, yeah.
Well, you say obviously, but nobody seems to contend with that. Like there is a more burdensome thing on a defendant in a criminal matter, and there are bigger penalties. But it's because we have a huge interest in not having people committing crimes.
Yeah.
So
crimes.
Yeah. So I don't understand why we would just, with a stroke of a pen say, the criminal stuff is too burdensome for the president, and we can't even trust that process at all anyway for the president. Well, if that was the case, like if we had a criminal, like tell me if you think the same is true or false. If we had a criminal justice system that was so corrupt that it would fabricate a charge all the way from the investigation, all the way down to the conviction, that it would be stopped by the immunity decision, but it wouldn't go after some other bullshit. Does that world exist? I think that becomes a very minor barrier. I think it protects way more bad activity than it protects good activity that we would want to protect from the president.
I think you're reasoning like a living constitutionalist. You're asking the question, what makes sense to me? Like, what is the way that this system would work? How could it be best optimized? How do we handle the realities of the day?
What I'm trying to make sense of is the rationale that Roberts gives, which is the living rationale, because you agree there is no history and there is no legal precedent anywhere in the U.S. Constitution or U.S. law, anything, or whatever part of the U.S., and that everybody acted that this wasn't the law. So I'm trying to figure out how Roberts is reasoning this here, because there is no history for any of this, right?
It is true that when you're in an area...
Wait, just real quick. There's no history for criminal immunity in the United States. I don't think for anybody, except for diplomats, right?
There's qualified immunity for... Well, that's typically not
that's
criminal.
For civil,
that's
generally.
Civil,
yeah. So there's no history. So I'm trying to figure out Roberts' rationale. Roberts' rationale is we can't trust the criminal courts for the president.
Well, I think Robert's rationale...
Which, by the way, that's like a process-oriented one. That's not an originalist.
If you asked him what his rationale would be, he'd say that my rationale is the structure of the Constitution.
Well, he would have to say that. But then I would say, well, where in the Constitution do you find this? And then he'd start to sound like an abortion guy. He'd be a Casey and Roe v. Wade guy.
He'd walk you through the same thing I did about pardons. And I know he would, because he wrote, that's what the opinion says. That's why I started with the core. The question is, the first question they asked is, should there be immunity in any situation? And they did the analysis with the core function. And then the second question was, now that we've established that there is immunity in some situations, what is the extent of those situations? And that's how you got the not in unofficial acts, but rebuttable presumption for non-core yet official acts.
Sure.
And in that case, I would agree with you that he's reasoning...
But his rationale there wasn't a legal one. His rationale there was, we can't trust the criminal courts.
But the important part is the first step was a constitutional inquiry. He was saying, what does the structure of the Constitution say?
I understand that, but that first step is boring and stupid. We know that the Congress, there's a name for this principle. You know what I don't...
Is boring and stupid a legal term? I should use that.
Boring and stupid. Another word for boring and stupid is this was not a question before the court because nobody was even asking this question. Well, everybody knows that the Congress can't steal things from the court or steal things from the president, and the president shouldn't be able to steal things. There's a name for this principle. You probably know
Separation of powers, yeah.
Well, sure. Yeah. I thought there was a more particular name, but like you can't steal. I don't remember if Gorsuch wrote about this in Chevron in overturning that, but like you can't take powers from the other people. Yeah. That was one of the things for overturning Chevron. Like the statutory interpretation doesn't get to be the executive's role. That's our role, right? You can't take the powers or assign them to other people.
Yeah, and
so we already knew
that's a big decision. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, which I actually think I largely agree with, because Gorsuch is not a hack insane person like Roberts or Alito, or in my opinion, he doesn't like Gorsuch. But back to Roberts, back to this ruling.
Trump made some good appointments.
Why would Roberts talk at all? I agree, Amy's awesome. Why would Roberts talk at all about whether or not a criminal court could fairly prosecute the president unless he was looking at it like a living, breathing constitutionalist? That's not a constitutional argument.
I don't quite remember the quote you're talking about, so I'm somewhat talking like out of my ass here. But the what I would say is, and if you look at like speeches Scalia gave about originalism, he's very transparent about this. No philosophy is perfect, and you can use it until you can't, right? Like there are times when it just doesn't work. The tools aren't available. Right?
That's so not true. I'm sorry. Why, at what point would it not, like what you're saying here sounds to me like one of those decisions where you're like, oof, I don't like this and it's really uncomfortable, but the text is clear and unambiguous. I don't have any counter historical examples. That sucks, but this is the ruling. But what you're saying is like, well, sometimes it's hard and you choose something else. That sounds like my argument. It's like, okay, well, when the text is clear and unambiguous, and now it's giving us something we don't like, well, now we have to fabricate some other type of reason.
Originalism does not mean the text is not limited to the text is clear and unambiguous.
Sure, there's other texts or whatever.
That's textualism. And
sure, okay.
Hopefully, every judge is a textualist. If the text is clear and unambiguous, there's nothing to talk about.
Sure.
Right?
There's like 3 stages and then the second. Yeah. But I'm saying that like it feels like he's not happy with the outcome of this, because why would you talk about the efficacy of the criminal courts at all, or whether or not they could give him a fair trial if we're just worried about what's in the Constitution? Yeah.
If you look at like an originalist toolkit, what are you using? You're using the text, of course. You're using
hatred for abortion. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You're using statements at the time that demonstrate how
the intent of the people that
publicly understood, not the intent of the people, how it was publicly understood. You're not trying to get in the heads of the people who wrote it. You're trying to, how did the public understand it at that time? That's the question.
Sure.
Right? The problem is that doesn't always get you an answer, right? So in this case, you say, okay, well, is there immunity at all? Well, I can look at the text of the Constitution. I can infer that there should be immunity because of this core powers analysis. Okay. Now, what are the boundaries of that immunity? We're kind of at the end of our toolkit. As you said, the cases were not, I always say not clear. They don't really even address it.
I mean, you can't criminalize an action that is explicitly granted to somebody in the Constitution, right? That seems pretty clear.
Yeah. So, but we're talking about ones, now we're in like the Youngstown type analysis. We're talking about an action like the president talking to the Secretary of State in Georgia, right? Where it's like, well, it feels quasi-official. The president does talk to state leaders from time to time, but it's not exclusive to him. That's not a core function, right? So the question is, to what extent should immunity extend there? And there's no originalist toolkit available. There's nothing to use, so then you have to use other interpretive tools.
Like the breathing, living.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, the idea that originalism is flawless and answers every question is
it's not about
laughable.
being flawless or answers every question. I understand there's going to be different
but then you use it to. It's a school of thought. You use it to the extent you can, and when you can't use it, you have to use something else because you have to decide the case.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
But then I feel like that's back at my first point, is that we're an originalist until we're not. But I guess the difference is you're saying that you're an originalist until the toolkit no longer works, and I'm saying that you would just choose not to use it when you feel like it.
Yeah, like I mean, you brought up abortion, so like if you.
Fuck abortion. That's really complicated.
We don't need to do that?
That's too complicated. Right. I guess if we, let's, okay.
I'm like, let's talk about the most controversial subject, Stephen. Let's
come to the idiot's world, the layman's world, and let's just think broadly. So I guess a couple questions. Do you think that Nixon felt like he had criminal immunity? Any kind of criminal immunity?
Do I think Nixon felt that way? I have no idea what Nixon felt. I don't know.
Do you think any president has ever felt like they're immune from criminal action?
But I don't know. And I again, this is kind of what I was saying earlier. There are questions that sometimes you really don't want the answers to.
I'm just saying, like, I feel like the fact that he resigned, I feel like the fact that, I mean, I'm pretty sure Nixon's administration was like, maybe even Nixon himself was compelled to hand over documents as a result of I think the Watergate investigation stuff. And then the fact that he accepted that pardon from Ford, the fact that Ford felt like he had to pardon him.
It was a really smart pardon.
Sure. But you don't pardon people for civil matters.
No, you pardon them to avoid having to ask the questions that we recently did, because it's essentially a constitutional crisis in the making. Like, you're asking the court to decide whether the current executive can use its powers against the former executive. This is, this is literally banana republic land if it goes too far. But at the same time, I'm sensitive to your concern. Like we do want to disincentivize crime, like obviously. So
you say banana republic land, but like if you had an executive that was so corrupt, he would already do it anyway, wouldn't he? Like you're protecting. It's like saying this sounds like me getting. It sounds like me wearing 2 shirts today because somebody might shoot at me.
If there was no immunity decision, do you think Trump would find a way to prosecute Biden?
I think Trump will prosecute no matter what.
You think he's going to do it even with the immunity decision?
I don't think the immunity decision is weighing in even remotely on his decision to go after people. Absolutely.
That would be interesting. Wait, all right. Gentlemen's bet on that, whether he prosecutes Biden?
I don't know if there would even be anything to prosecute him for.
Oh, if he's so corrupt, it doesn't matter. You just said that.
Yeah, but I don't think Biden is like a threat anymore. He doesn't do anything to him.
Okay, so you're saying he's not going to prosecute him? Not
the problem. The problem is that
I thought Trump was this vindictive, maniacal madman who would do things just to like spite people. But
I don't know if he would do it just to spite people. But the issue is that like Democrats don't commit crimes as flagrantly and as shamelessly.
If you're a corrupt madman, it doesn't matter whether they committed the crime or not.
Sure. So I think he would probably go after people who are more relevant. So for instance, the civil litigation that he has right now against multiple parties, like a pollster in Iowa.
He's definitely not going to go after Biden. We agree on that?
I don't know if I don't even know.
I mean, I'm not going to hold you to it, but it seems unlikely, right?
I don't think he would.
Yeah, the pollster case, by the way, is laughable. It's a terrible case, and if people,
to be clear, I don't think it's laughable and terrible. I think it's abhorrent, right? That should be like a...
Well, I mean, it's going to lose. I think he's going to lose quickly and easily. But if people are interested in that sort of stuff, just to give the plug, the group to follow is FIRE. They are like by far the best free speech organization in the country right now. And if there's a legal group to support it, they are it. So that's my plug. They're fantastic. And if anybody from FIRE is listening, send me pro bono work. I've been waiting. I don't know what the holdup is.
Sure. Okay, so then going back, we legitimately feel like Nixon felt like he could have been criminally prosecuted.
I have no idea what Nixon felt.
Wasn't what I actually haven't studied Watergate in depth.
Yeah,
wasn't he using the FBI to do the spying?
This is not my area. I have no fucking idea. And I'm not telepathic, nor do I have a time machine.
Well, hold on. Don't say that I'm not telepathic because we have to look at like how people are acting and how they're thinking to get like an idea sometimes of what of like what's in people's minds, right? I feel like going back through time, do we feel like the framers of the Constitution would have wanted a president that was beyond all criminal prosecution?
Do I think the founders were thinking about immunity when they wrote the Constitution?
Yeah, that the founders, the people who wrote the Constitution, the people who were drafting amendments afterwards, through all the history of our country, do you think at any point in time people were like, the president probably shouldn't?
Have you read the Federalist Papers?
I actually have read about 30 of them. I'm working my way through them.
They are a labor of love. So they're absolutely worth it. They are not an easy read and they are not fun. But one of the things that's really interesting about them is that the framers, when they were thinking about the federal government, like the idea that there would be police enforcement by the federal government at all was not within their contemplation. They thought the federal government was for unifying the nation, defense, trade, border. Like, I mean, the idea of like a modern FBI or NSA is like totally outside the veil of their comprehension. So it's a question that I don't think I can answer because I think the idea that there would be this kind of federal apparatus in the first place would have shocked them.
Okay, so then if there was absolutely none of this at the time, and there's none of this in mid or recent history, then shouldn't the decision have been, it's unfortunate, but we don't believe the president has these protections here. Congress needs a new amendment. The Constitution needs to be amended or something, and like that's that. Because it feels like we're basically saying that like, well, this is really unfortunate. There is no source for this. Our originalist toolkit has failed.
No, because of step one. You say, well, you do the core powers analysis. You say, well, there must be some limits because there are things Congress cannot criminalize. What are the things they can't criminalize? The things the executive has exclusive power granted by the Constitution over. So since Congress can't criminalize those things, there must be immunity for those things, which is why there's immunity. Again, Justice Barrett's concurrence was better because she lays it out in, I think, a much more straightforward way where they say, like, you ask the question, does this law would this law touch on the president's core power in this way? If so, as applied, it's unconstitutional. Doesn't mean that it's unconstitutional in general.
Sure. Same thing with like, I think that there's a similar reasoning for this. But like, you can't kill people unless you have a self-defense reason or whatever, right? But police can, right? In pursuit of people, right? And you can't criminally charge a police officer for doing his job because these are obviously contradictory in nature or whatever. And I think it's similar for the president. You can't criminalize him literally doing his job.
We just talked about this a second ago, and I confess I didn't know the answer, so I don't want to reverse myself on that. Sure. I know qualified immunity is typically in the civil context.
Civil context and the matter of doing your job,
And then the question of like, if you were like in a high-speed chase and you killed someone, could they charge you? I think there is some analysis there, but I don't want to pretend I know.
Well, sure. I mean, we have recent history to this. We can look at the Derek Chauvin, right?
Yeah. So there's certainly cases where you can be charged.
Yeah.
Right?
So he was doing his job.
Yeah.
And he was still criminally charged.
So obviously there are exceptions to if there is immunity in that area. There are obviously exceptions. Otherwise, you wouldn't have that outcome.
Which there wouldn't be for the president because it's absolute for the core powers.
Yeah. Well, there's only one president.
What for? What?
There's only one president, and police don't have a constitutional role.
For sure, kind of. Well,
not sure, kind of. I mean,
there's only one president. Well, I'm thinking there's only one president. I don't know what the rationale would be for this immunity not flowing all the way through the executive branch.
Because there's only one executive. There's
only one president.
Yeah, there's the executive.
Yeah, but I mean, like the only reason
in the president.
Yeah, but the only reason he has offices and officers is to help him carry out his duties, right?
Yeah.
In a perfect world, if the president was like a super mind machine, he would do everything. He would be the EPA and the FBI. He would be out like busting. Yeah, but like so he has officers to help him.
But they are not vested with with constitutional authority in the way that he is. Like that the whole thing is a constitutional analysis. He is the president. They are not. It's not. I mean,
Aren't there warring opinions on this? Simple. When it comes to like
There's
what is it called?
opinions on every damn thing, but I'm not sure.
I'm not saying like crazy, but I'm like aren't there genuine opinions over whether or not like I think it's called what unitary executive theory or whatever over like how much
that's Thomas's baby.
Sure. The would you say so you would say that's a crazy opinion or crazy judge?
No. I mean, I think unitary executive theory is a fair reading of the Constitution.
Okay.
It has.
Is it fair to say that under that reading or under that idea that the power that this immunity would then flow from the president, at least to his cabinet, if not further through all of his?
It's his power. The unitary executive means it's his power. It doesn't. The immunity wouldn't flow. If you are unitary executive theory, if you believe in unitary executive theory, which I don't have a strong position on, so I'm not going to take a stance on it. But then the immunity decision is very easy. Like I don't think Thomas lost a second of sleep over this one because the answer is pretty obvious if you're a unitary executive theory guy.
Maybe. I don't think Thomas was thinking about this at all, though. I think he was too busy writing up his support for Trump in the Eileen Cannon case.
Oh, the telepathy comes in. Yeah.
Well, why else would he write that concurrence for this ruling?
What was it about that bothered you?
It had nothing to do with the case, right? Didn't he just wrote the concurrence to say that special prosecutors had no foundation in the Constitution? And so I think Judge Cannon cited his concurrence here to toss Trump's case because of Jack Smith, but I don't think that had anything to do with the case. I don't think that had anything to do with the question before the court, was it?
But it did, because if he is correct about that, then there would be no prosecution for which you need to decide the immunity question.
No, yeah, but I don't think that was a question before the court at all for there.
I don't know the answer to that. So
nobody else touches on it at all. Roberts doesn't, Amy doesn't. Nobody even.
Have you? God, I wish I could remember the name of this case. It's a death penalty case. This is just like quirky Justice Thomas stuff. There's there was a case where he wrote the opinion and everybody signed on. It was basically a good opinion, but they were all like, except for part 3, because in part 3 he just gave like the life story of the family of the victim and the son who grew up to be a football player and put in like a big picture of him. Thomas does sometimes go a bit beyond the subject matter.
Sure. Okay. I'm not. I would have to go back and check, but I don't even think Thomas. I don't even know if he writes about the immunity stuff in his concurrence. I think it's solely on the special prosecutor thing.
Yeah, because he agreed. He agreed in full on the decision, and then wrote a concurrence about the thing he wanted to talk about.
Yeah. Okay.
Not as good a concurrence as Barrett's, let's say.
Sure, because it was completely irrelevant. But okay. Sorry, we were at a place right before this. Presidential
immunity. I was crushing you in the logic of core powers, and you were about to concede.
Yeah. Oh no, I agreed that the core powers shouldn't be legislated against because literally nobody's ever asked that because everybody knows that, and it's pointless to even write that. The question is all the things related to them.
But if you agree with that, then you agree that you agree take care to enforce the law is a core executive power.
Yeah.
Okay, so then him talking to his AG is a core executive act, and that's why he was immunized.
Well, why wouldn't take care to enforce the law also extend then to the Attorney General?
That's the one that was immunized. Yeah.
No, but then the Attorney General. What about when he wants to hire or fire people? Take care to enforce the law.
He's not the president.
No, but
it's just the Constitution does not apply to him.
Okay, let's say that the Congress were to pass laws basically saying that they could hire and fire anybody beneath cabinet level position, beneath the Attorney General, or that they were going to criminalize the Attorney General. Let's say somebody looked at the Attorney General and they were going to criminalize his action because they thought that he bribed somebody to hire or fire an associate Attorney General or his deputy attorney general. Why wouldn't the exact same arguments flow through that the president's not able to carry out his power? He's supposed to be able to nominate an attorney general who can run the Department of Justice. He can't do that job because now the courts and the criminal system has come in and they're interfering. Like,
sorry, I lost you a little bit in the hypothetical. You're saying they created a law that says that the president cannot.
Or not. I'm sorry. We don't have to say a law. The attorney general. Let's say the attorney general takes a bribe to hire or fire the deputy AG. I think that deputy AG, does that come from the president or is that the AG?
I'm not positive.
I'm guessing it comes from the AG, but whatever. How far do I need to go, right? And then let's say that they want to go. Let's say that people want to file criminal charges because they're saying he did a bad action.
Yeah.
Well, if we're saying that the president obviously needs to be able to carry out his job to appoint, to nominate an attorney general, because hiring and firing is as exclusive and preclusive as your role can get. But if then that guy can be criminally charged with carrying out, the assignments of the job, why would those arguments not flow directly to him? How can the president carry out his job if his AG is constantly getting charged with crimes?
You didn't interfere with his hiring or firing.
Okay, but you're not hiring and firing to carry out the jobs of that.
Well, you say, I hired him. Mm-hmm. You criminally prosecuted him. Now he's in jail. I might choose to fire him because he's pretty useless in jail. But like the president's power wasn't impacted there. The question was, can you prosecute his underling? And it sounds like the answer should be yes. I haven't thought about it much, but
if you want to go with that narrow of an answer, which I would agree with, then we would just say, okay, well then we would look at a criminal charge for, say, bribery, and we would say that, well, he's not being charged for pardoning somebody.
This hypothetical doesn't make a ton of sense because we're talking about like who's charging the crime. The president's still in power. So these are all after
let's
the president
say after he gets
power.
out. Well, because it's the same way it works with President Trump.
It's a little bit of the hypothetical is like a bit stretched.
Well, no, it's the exact same hypothetical because President Trump wasn't charged until he was out of power.
Yeah,
right?
but if you put it in the correct timeline, president hires somebody, they're an underling in one of his agencies, right?
Yeah.
They leave office. The next president charges the underling.
Yeah.
That has nothing, like the former president's hiring and firing power isn't even implicated. They're not in office anymore.
Sure.
Right. So like it wouldn't matter. Like there's no constitutional argument.
Okay. But I guess my question then though is, let's say that the you fucked my brain up with that.
I'm doing my best.
You're doing your best. Yeah. Hold on. Let me where were we at? Okay, president hires and fires somebody.
This is what I was saying.
No, absolutely not. President hires or fires somebody, and then that guy has a choice to hire or fire somebody. And we're saying that that guy can be criminally prosecuted because it's not interfering with the president's job to hire and fire somebody, which is a core power, preclusive. Oh, okay.
Sure. This is
but then
really
let's
about
say
the absence of time machines, not about
no. None of this is time machines. All the timeline is the exact same for Trump. These are real life things that have happened in a sequence of time. Let's say that Trump comes out and you want to criminally prosecute him for improperly, directing his DOJ to do something. Right? That doesn't implicate his ability to hire or fire. He was still always allowed to hire and fire. The problem is the fraudulent direction to his head.
And that's immune.
I don't think
That's immune.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's not a core. It is not a core power of the president to tell his attorney general to commit crimes.
Well, it's a core power of the president to tell it to take care to enforce the law, and his attorney general, their relationship is about.
Ready?
I have literal bated breath. It's so dramatic.
Okay. I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to ask a question. This is a killer question. My God.
Shit.
Do you practice right now? Because I might end your whole career with this question. This is a big one. Ready?
This is a bummer.
It's a big one. Okay. No, I'm curious. Okay. So question.
And with that, we're going to take a break.
Yeah. Question. Are you, and I'm not trying to like knowledge or whatever, I'm just curious. You're pretty familiar with all the stuff that happened in the DOJ? It doesn't have to be everything, but just basically that like Trump was asking them to.
I'm probably much less familiar than you are.
Okay, sure. So just assume what I'm saying is true without, you don't have to repeat this.
I'll assume the facts.
Yeah, that Trump was telling his Department of Justice, I need you to send out fraudulent letters to the states saying that we found voter fraud so that they flip their electoral votes, basically. And all of this goes towards the conspiracy against rights and all that. Okay. Now, all of the stuff that happened in relation to this, all of that was off limits because it's a core power of the president to hire and fire his attorney general, right?
That would be wise. I don't think it's hire and fire. Yeah, okay.
That was the core and or to carry out the law, whatever.
Take out the law. Yeah, it's one of them.
Right. Okay. Fuck. Wait.
This was a killer question.
No. Well, you just changed it a little bit because the core power. You're making it about this enforced law. I think the core power that Roberts implicated was just his hiring and firing of
he has multiple core powers.
Okay. I thought the hiring and firing of the DOJ was the thing that Roberts called it. Because my killer question was going to be, let's say that exact same thing happened, but he didn't hire or fire anybody based off what happened. Would it then be criminally probable?
But he didn't hire
because my understanding is Roberts wrote his opinion basically off the concept that the president, if he's allowed to do anything that's core, it's him nominating his cabinet heads. If there was ever a core power, this is absolutely preclusively and conclusively.
And pardoning and taking care to enforce the law.
Sure, yeah. And so that was one of the reasons why, for the AG stuff, all of this is off the table, because the president, he can fire and hire for whatever reason he wants. But if there was no firing or hiring involved, would we then be able to probe that fraudulent behavior?
I think it's useful when, and maybe this will explain.
Sure.
Remember we were talking earlier about like you can't, one of the things the ruling says, you can't look into the motivations and you can't look into whether it's a sham.
Correct.
Right? So it's helpful to think about how this might proceed if it was actually charged.
Sure.
Right? So someone brings charges and they say, you directed your attorney general to engage in all these fraudulent prosecutions because you were doing X, Y, and Z thing.
Yeah.
Of course, Trump or whoever it is not going to agree to that characterization. They're going to say, no, I directed my attorney general to look at crimes. And looking at crimes is a core executive power. And my decision to fire them if they don't follow my directions is, as you said, a core executive power. And you're not allowed to look into whether or not it's a sham. So it's immune.
Sure.
Yeah.
By what you're saying, yeah. I wouldn't agree with that, but...
Yeah, but I mean, that's why that's why that section got immunized, because if you think about how this would play out in an actual court, there's no way that you could get to the fact that it is in fact a fraudulent direction to the
right
AG.
Now you can't with the immunity realm, but I think we should probably be able to ask those questions, don't you?
Well, this is the exception swallowing the rule problem. If you don't have the rule about no shams and you can't look into the motivations, then you basically don't have immunity at all. So when they said, okay, well, we have this core immunity, then they say, what does that entail? It does entail having these protections, which are, I would say, truthfully, kind of a bummer. Like when I read them the first time, they struck me as being pretty harsh. But at the same time, if you don't have them, there's no immunity left, because it's...
Well, but we've survived for hundreds of years as a country without the president ever needing these to perform his job.
Yeah, there were a lot of those presidential criminal prosecution cases where this came up, huh?
But there weren't a lot of presidents committing crimes this blatantly and openly.
Yeah, I mean, this is all novel. So when people say like, well, this never came up before, it's like, yeah, it never came up before. So,
but maybe one of the reasons why it hasn't come up before is because presidents assumed that they couldn't commit crimes.
Well, and this is the thing I was saying earlier, which is like, if you want to solve this problem, the solution is not to vote. Like the president's a very serious job.
No, voting has nothing to do with committing crimes.
No, it's a very serious job. Don't vote for people who are going to commit crimes.
That's nothing to do with committing crimes.
No,
whether or not you should be held criminally liable for something should have nothing to do with whether or not somebody wins in office. You could vote for people for a whole bunch of stupid reasons. That's why we have restrictions on who we're even allowed to vote for.
I think we're talking past each other. I'm saying that the solution to this is inherently political. There are solutions like impeachment, which is inherently political. The solution is the voting booth.
Yeah, but I think if you look at the core, speaking of the Federalist Papers, I don't remember, it was one of the 70s. If you look at things like impeachment, right, the reason why impeachment exists, and part of the motivating factor. Actually, wait, I don't think this was a Federalist paper. I think it's just quotes from fucking Benjamin Franklin or something. People were arguing over this. One of the good things about impeachment was there are only two ways to get rid of a king. I think you either fabricate charges against them or you assassinate them.
Yeah.
It's obviously problematic for a number of reasons. So we invented impeachment. So now we have a way to take people out of office that doesn't involve criminal charges or killing them. Because if it's only criminal charges that removes a bad actor from office, now we're in a really weird world where, So, but the idea that, the way to fight against criminal charges is to just not vote for them. I feel like we're mixing these worlds up. Like when I'm thinking the criminal charges stuff, that should be totally separately removed. It's a totally separate question. It's not a political question. It shouldn't be at that point. Impeachment can be a question politically because that's a political process, right? You convict in the Senate, you die in the House, whatever. Like that's a political process. But criminal stuff should be.
Well, but here's the problem.
Yeah.
The founders probably didn't even envision a world with the FBI or the DOJ, but. If take care to enforce the law is a core power, which it is, then if the next president is just as corrupt as the former one, or even more corrupt, right? As you said earlier, you can direct your DOJ to do whatever you want them to do.
Correct.
Right? So
I agree. But in your world with immunity, nothing is saved or nothing happens there.
Well, you still can't prosecute the former president.
Yeah, you can. You just said he's just as corrupt. He'll make stuff up. He'll prosecute him for whatever reason.
But what power does he have? He has the executive, but lo and behold, the judiciary comes in and saves the day and says, thou shalt not immune.
I mean, assuming they say that.
Well,
but even if
what
they,
said.
but even if they don't say that, if he could just say, oh, we're charging for a whole bunch of other stuff that's just not part of his corporate. You could fabricate stuff. But in my world, where there is no immunity, a righteous president could come in after a criminal president and prosecute him if it needs to be that way.
And then a corrupt president could come in after the righteous president and prosecute him.
Are you a Second Amendment guy?
Yeah.
Where's the saying for the Second Amendment of when you take away guns from the good guys, you just say that the bad guys can operate with impunity? That's all the immunity thing is doing. If somebody's going to be so corrupt that they would corruptly charge somebody with crimes, I doubt an immunity decision is ever getting in their way. The only thing the immunity decision does is protect a corrupt president from being prosecuted by a guy who would respect the laws.
I'm not sure that follows the. First of all, like the argument you're making about the Second Amendment isn't a legal argument.
No, it's not a legal argument. That's a total moralistic one.
Yeah,
of course.
it's a moralistic one, so it just doesn't apply. And I mean, if we want to talk Second Amendment, we can. I'm not a gun owner, but I'm a Second Amendment guy because it's the Second Amendment. And I just take that seriously because it is.
Sure.
But it's actually this total tangent.
Okay.
You have that gun in your background when you film at home.
Yeah, it's a shotgun. Very nice shotgun.
The funniest thing was the reason I actually decided that I was like, this is during COVID and I'm working at home and I'm like, oh my God, I need something to watch, watching political commentary. Your stuff came up and I was like, I don't, this guy's talking some stuff. I don't know if I should listen to him. The gun actually was the draw.
That's good.
Well, and the reason it was is I was like, that is totally different and out of character with the rest of the opinions that he's saying, which implies that he is making up, he's making up his own decisions. He's not just walking some kind of partisan line, which was actually why the content was appealing. So there you go.
Well, thanks.
Second Amendment.
That's why I had the blue hair too.
Together.
So okay.
Yeah, well, the blue hair was a bummer, but everyone makes mistakes.
Sure. Okay. I guess we've hit a black hole with this. So what is the response to? I guess just like I feel like that the issue with the criminal immunity is the criminal immunity won't keep a bad president from going after somebody before because they will just make shit up to go after them if they really wanted to.
I mean, if you're talking about a world where they're just like fabricating evidence and fabricating actions and saying, you outside the purview of your office, we're selling crack to children and we have AI video of it and we're going to pass it. I mean, I think that probably is not protected by the
Just to clarify, though, with what you just said, because you made that sound ridiculous, but that is the world that Robert says we live in now, because he's saying you would go through the whole indictment, the whole grand jury process and everything, and that would all be fake and bullshit. And that's why we need immunities to protect that, right? Because in a functioning world, we would... He said exactly what I've been saying the whole time. He said there's core powers, and then once you've said that there is immunity, then you have to figure out how far it applies. He's not reasoning in the way that you're describing. I think that's exactly how he reasons. That's why he brings up the fact that a president could never get a fair trial. I think he explicitly says that. He writes in his opinion.
After he's determined that there is immunity, and now we're in the world where we're trying to figure out what to do about it. But you see, that's not the starting point, and that does make a difference.
I agree with the starting point, but he takes it much further than you can't criminalize pardons. He's saying you can't criminalize crimes in connections with pardons. That second part is a huge connector, right?
Well, so
we're not talking about criminalizing core powers. We're talking about, does every single crime connected to a core power also become immune? That's what Roberts has basically said.
Well, I think now we're circling.
Okay, sure.
This comes back to our original hypo.
Okay.
And I think we're probably going to dive back into the evidentiary rule if we go down this road, but we can do it again if you want.
Let's say your argument there was you don't know if it goes to a judge first or judge and jury. Let's say that it doesn't go to the judge at all.
If the judge can't look at it, then the evidentiary ruling was a nightmarish error, and I hope that Barrett ends up having the last laugh on this, because she was correct that the evidentiary rule is unnecessary, and if it can't go to the judge, then that's a major flaw in the opinion.
This is a super procedural question. Okay, and I don't know. So for the interlocutory appeal stuff, I thought that was only for the presumptive immunity actions, but for the core stuff, I guess I don't know at what stage that gets addressed, but I don't think any of that. Like, I think as long as you say, like, oh, this is with a pardon and, like, it's done. I don't know if a judge ever even reviews that stuff ever.
It does, yeah. Because who would be deciding that the immunity applies? It would be a judge. So
but I don't know how deep he is allowed to dive into.
Yeah, so if you imagine this playing out, right? They bring charges, and somebody says, okay, we think you did X, Y, and Z thing. We'll go back to the original. Like, you said you need to, kill 100 school children in exchange for this pardon. And the prosecution is very clever, and they're saying, we'd like to parse that out. We'd like to say that, the pardon part, we're not going to charge, but we're not even going to talk about that as like a bribe or anything. We're just going to talk about, soliciting homicide, and we're going to talk
Sure.
about that.
Okay.
We're going to leave the whole pardon stuff out. And Judge, we're going to give you the evidence, and we would like you to look at it and say what's out and what's in for the case. Because you can do that. You can have the judge look at it without the jury and say, okay, well, this is in, this is out, this crosses the line, this touches the pardon stuff too closely, draw those lines. And then you might have interlocutory appeals about whether he got it right.
Okay.
If that's allowed, then the courts have a lot more leeway to look into this kind of like unofficial acts that are really close to an official act and see if they can separate it out. They might not be able to, but they could try.
Okay.
If the judge isn't allowed to see even that material, then the evidentiary rule is like really a nightmare. So I'm hoping it is the former. I am not 100% sure on this. I've been reading the opinion. I don't think it's a model of clarity.
Okay.
And this is why I thought
get-
Justice Barrett was better, because I thought hers was a safer approach.
For criminal procedure, an indictment can come before you've ever put, like the indictment is the criminal complaint, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the indictment comes before you've spoken to the judge, or could, right?
Yeah, so the indictment with the grand jury.
Sure. Before fuck you. Okay, we'll get there. Hold on. Before the indictment, you can like subpoena and gather information though, right? Or does that only come after the...
Yes, you can subpoena and gather information, but then if there's litigation about it, like let's say because the way this typically works is a lawyer can issue a subpoena without the judge looking at it. But if the other side says, no, that's wrong, you're not allowed to issue that subpoena, then they're going to go to a judge and say, you're not allowed to do this.
Sure, okay.
And then it ends up before the judge and the same scenario would play out.
Gotcha, okay. Yeah, I guess final point on this, and we'll move on from this. So there's a world where I could agree with what you're saying, but again, I feel like the huge issue is, let's say that what you just said, where the prosecution wants to parse this out better, to try to stay away from that. Why then did Roberts not remand all the behavior back to the district court? Why did he explicitly bucket the whole DOJ thing and say all of this is off the table, instead of giving the government a chance to parse?
Because that one, giving directions to your attorney general about law enforcement it's not the scenario you gave before, where there's like a totally unofficial thing with a kind of a tangential connection to an official thing. This is all an official thing.
Okay, so if he had told his AG, go kill people, it would be off the table.
If he had told his AG,
go kill people.
I would like you to go enforce the law and lock up those evildoers. And also, as a separate matter, can you please kill my mailman?
No, not a separate matter. I think that we need to enforce the law because the threat is too high. You need to go kill everybody.
I phrased it that way to be funny, but also because the easier the separation is, the easier it would be to parse.
Sure, but now that I know I have criminal immunity, I'm not going to make it easy to parse.
Oh, no, of course not. Of course.
All right. Okay.
Sorry,
okay.
But there's one point on this before we go to the next thing.
Go ahead, yeah.
Just because I think it's interesting.
Sure.
One of the funniest things about arguing my side of this, right, is that I think the decision was right because the logic was good, not because I loved the outcome, right? And if there is a problem in the second Trump term, don't you hope that I'm right, that there are ways to parse this, that there are exceptions to the immunity, that there are things the court can do to inquire?
I mean, I would hope that would be the case, but my concern is that the power to do that has been so insanely limited. I don't know if they have that power anymore. And I don't know if Trump will act differently, knowing that he now enjoys those broad criminal protections.
I think what's interesting about it is when I argue this point, it's almost universally with somebody to the left of me who's saying the decision is much, much worse than I think it is, and me saying there actually are some ways that this decision could be read by a future court that would allow for prosecutions or some legal action in ways that maybe you're not thinking about. But if push came to shove and those prosecutions were happening, they would hope that the court read something I wrote or said and say, oh, that's a good idea. You're going to hope I'm right if it comes down to it.
Yeah, of course, but we're not arguing about what should the best outcome reading of that thing be, because I would agree. I would try to argue the strongest version for the side of the government.
You should be on my side.
But it's like you've given a person cancer, and now we're arguing over the outcome of treatments. And you want to do chemotherapy, and I want to do some other thing, and you're like, well, don't you hope that my treatment is the best? And I'm like, yeah, but I wish we just didn't have cancer.
Yeah,
the argument is over the initial decision. I like having had cancer, or I'm not. But if we did have cancer, then we would obviously hope for the best treatment. But ideally, we just wouldn't have cancer. And I think this decision is cancer. And we're talking about But I'll give you the final word if you want, because and then we can do the next part, or. Because we need to talk about, you're optimistic for our criminally immune president now, for only his core powers though. Why are you optimistic? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm optimistic because there were a number of things that were on the ballot this time. And there's so many things about Trump that you could point out that
Give me
are horrible.
Sure.
And I would say, yeah.
what are your top 2 things on the ballot you think Trump will do good on that would have been superior to a Harris administration, I guess?
Originalism, court packing.
Okay.
I have no question.
So the originalism has nothing to do with Trump because he's not interpreting it.
It has to do with what judges he, assuming he gets some more Supreme Court picks, it's going to have quite a lot to do with that.
Yeah, let's hope that doesn't happen.
And quite frankly, and this is what we're talking about on Wick's panel. And if I didn't shout him out earlier, sorry, Wick. Wick's awesome. Everyone should watch him. Court packing was like, I don't know if it was officially part of the platform, but it was pretty highly talked about on the Democratic side.
It's been universally that, like, I think the Democratic people have said they're not court packing. Biden, I think, explicitly said he wouldn't pack the courts.
Harris was not so clear.
I feel like I don't know if she was, I thought she said it. I know Biden said he explicitly wouldn't. I don't think court packing is on the agenda for it, even if Harris would have won. Let's say.
God, I hope not.
Okay.
But yeah, those were obviously my my top ones where I thought that he would be better. I thought he would be better on Israel, probably worse on Ukraine. I thought he would be better on the border, but probably in a way that has a lot of rough edges around it. There were a lot of things he'd be better. Now, I didn't vote for him because we talked about this earlier, like he did things that were disqualifying, so I can't vote for him. But there are things that he did in his first term that if he does in his second term, and who knows, like he was listening to the Federalist Society about his judge picks, and if you look at, like we talked about Justice Gorsuch, we talked about Justice Barrett, he made some good picks. I hope he makes good picks again next time around.
Okay. I feel like the border stuff is kind of weak because he didn't do anything about the border last time. Foreign policy wise is just a whole thing, I guess. Like there was no like big legislative accomplishments on the border. He didn't change anything of substance. Like he got lucky that he could Title 42 his way to some decent immigration stuff. But I think his last year at the border was the highest amount of like illegal crossings than any year under Obama even.
Obama was so much better on the border than Biden was. I mean, it's not comparable.
Yeah, but I'm talking about Trump. I'm just saying that on Trump's last year, it was getting bad, and then he got to switch because he couldn't rely on Title 42 anymore.
Well, I mean, I think the thing about border policy that's fascinating is that because it's executive and because the executive has so much power over border policy, all the playing in the joints is in executive policy.
Well, but ideally, we wouldn't want it to be that way, right?
Oh, no. I think it must be. Like, the border is one of the things that is, like, within the executive purview very clearly.
In matters of national security, sure, but like, don't we want like immigration, like a good comprehensive change in our immigration policy to not have to rely on the executive? Yeah.
But you're asking two different questions now. Do we want a good policy? Absolutely. Is it primarily going to be executive driven because it's the border? Yes.
Well, we would have at least had some strengthening of the border onto that Lankford bill for immigration that Trump pulled the plug on.
The thing about that bill, I'm going to date myself. Did you watch The West Wing?
Like one episode.
Okay. The idea that like somebody's running on something, so we're going to propose a solution, so they have to oppose it. That's like it's such a political trope that it's actually like it's in theater, right? Like it's a known thing. So what did we have? We had a really aggressively terrible border policy under Biden, and I mean aggressively terrible because my best explanation for it is that he was almost playing like the not Trump game. Like I want to do whatever Trump did, I'm going to do the opposite of him. There's things Trump did at the border that I disagree with, but you don't need to be the polar opposite. You could be more nuanced. You could do what Obama did. In any event, then we have this bill. Obviously, Trump doesn't want the bill because it's terrible for him politically, and that played out the way it played out. But then Biden was able to control the border without the bill because it always was about executive policy.
I don't think he got as much as, I don't think through executive action, like I don't think he was able to expand the funding or the amount of like asylum judges.
No.
Anything there. He was just, I think he kind of capped it a little, but I think that is being challenged now through the courts, and it's hard to know how much he can cap that indefinitely.
What I'm saying is, and I'm not saying this to advocate for what Trump did.
Sure.
But like you can go from kids in cages to Biden's policy to Biden's current policy without any change in the law. That's the scale of executive discretion in this area. Like the executive has so much discretion to control just through soft policy.
I don't think when the asylum stuff started to become a big issue, I don't think that would have lasted for 3 years as him just like trying to cap the asylum stuff.
Asylum is another
Well, I think
mess.
asylum is that's the problem. Like I don't think right now in the U.S., I don't think for the last 4 years we've had an illegal immigration problem. We've had an asylum claim problem. That's like been the thing.
This is putting me in dangerous territory because I do pro bono work and some of it is asylum work. So yes.
Like haven't there been like?
I'm going to just to be totally transparent. There is obviously an asylum fraud client. Problem. None of them are my clients.
Sure.
But I think the issue is the the catch and release and the combination of that, and just that you can claim asylum, and the backlog is so insane that it becomes a nightmare. I mean, actually, during the first Trump administration, he did this thing where he switched the order. So normally, it's with judges, it's first in, first out, and you do the cases in order. One of his changes to the policy was he wanted to switch it. So instead of doing first in, first out, they did last in, first out. So if you had a new case, you were heard instantly. And that was his way of attempting to combat asylum fraud, because you could have the new cases heard right away. The weird side effect of this, which I don't think was intentional, but I had a client who was kind of in the middle of the pile. And as a result, he got to be in the country for
That's
years.
Interesting that was changed. I guess I would have to go back and look at the rationale, because I don't think I think asylum claims became like a big known loophole after COVID ended.
It's gotten...
The level of claims we've gotten
the magnitude of the problem has changed, but the fact that this is an issue has been known, and that's why he instituted that change, because it did allow it allowed his administration to hear new cases faster and in theory combat fraud. It had downsides.
Sure.
Though the weird thing about those downsides is that for a asylum client who's been in the country waiting for their hearing for a long time, the idea that they have to wait like an extra 5 years and they have all privileges and benefits while they're here waiting is not really a downside. So it was great news for my client, but that's one case.
Do you worry at all about like things like tariffs or any of the economic stuff? Do you worry at all about like deficit spending or?
Yeah, deficit is, I think, the issue that is, if we don't solve it soon, it's going to be the only issue.
Do you think Trump is going to have higher deficits or lower deficits than Biden?
So I would say optimistic, but measuredly so. Like, I know, like, we can talk about the circus that is Doge till we're blue in the face. It is very, very hard to cut federal spending because so much of it is mandatory. And if you start cutting into discretionary, I actually don't have the figure. Do you know the figure for discretionary?
1.7.
Yeah, and our deficit is 1.1 trillion. It's one.
I don't know what the budget deficit is right now.
Yeah, so you have to do a 2/3 cut of all discretionary spending to break even. That's not possible.
Sure, to break even, yeah. But like I'm saying, when I say lower, I'm not saying lower the debt, as in like we actually hit a budget surplus. I'm saying, do you think the deficit will even be lower than what they were under Biden? Like, do you think how much he has to borrow every year to pay for the government? Because I'm looking at two huge things. One is they seem unwilling to cut anything. Two, it seems like he wants to extend, three things. Two, they want to extend the Trump tax cuts, which is also going to be super fiscally burdensome. And then three, all of the talk seems to be revolving around expanding the funding for like the largest thing, which is our DOD. And they all want to make that like if you're going to expand this by $200 billion, where are you going to find the cuts in your discretionary budget to compensate for that?
Yeah, the scope of the deficit problem is so immense that it almost boggles the mind. Because I was talking about some the other day where it's like, I think it might have been one Wick show too, where if, let's say, Elon and Vivek were like hyper successful, and they found, let's say they found like $300 billion of waste and fraud that they eliminated, which I think anyone would call like, wow, that's a lot. Good job. Good on you guys.
Yeah.
It almost doesn't matter. It's like a rounding error because the numbers, it would matter, but it's like you're still running this crazy deficit. So I think that is going to be a serious problem. There is a window for deregulation, and if deregulation has economic benefits, that might be a way to grow out of it. But I think I'm optimistic in this area, but it might be wishful thinking. It's the first time in my entire adult life, I guess since Bill Clinton, so since my entire adult life, that there's been any political will around cutting regs, cutting deficit. Will they pull it off? I don't know. I'm rooting for him, but I don't know that I can say that I think they will.
Okay. Did he make a hand gesture at me?
He did. He was jerking you off like this.
Oh.
That's not an enthused reaction.
No, I was just trying to think if that means
your boy
off immediately or wait, okay. A couple more real quick. Tariffs, do you think he's going to go through with that?
God, I hope not. I mean, there are probably isolated incidents where some kind of retaliatory tariff like works on like a game theory perspective, like you just
sure. But we're talking about the across.
But if
you're
talking about like cross the board, cross blanket tariffs, I hope not. I don't think that works.
Sure.
It did, I think, have the desired effect of like making Canada super nervous and letting him emasculate Trudeau, which I'm sure he enjoyed.
Do you think it's the threatening of the threatening of Greenland and Mexico for like military invasion? You think that's a good?
Did he actually? My recollection, and you would
He was
know
asked in
better
a
than
press
me,
conference if he would
he
take
was
the
asked,
military off the table.
Will you take it off the table? And he said no.
That's a threat.
Well, I think people.
If I were to go home and I were to tell my girlfriend that I was considering beating the shit out of her and like taking her cat and eating it or whatever, and then we would have a later discussion. She's like, "Have you like taken back like the beat me up thing?" It's like that's still on the table.
Well, no, that's not. I think a better analogy would be like if we got a beer after this, and I said, "Hey, I'll get the tab," and you said, "Hey, would you take military invasion of Greenland off the table?" I'd say, "Oh, I didn't really think about that, but no, I don't know."
Well, but he did think about it. The only reason we're having this conversation about it is because he's already threatened it.
Well, that's what I was asking you. I mean, you know, and I said you know better than me. Did he threaten it, or was he only asked, "Will you take it off the table"? I don't think he brought it up. I think he was asked, "Will you take it off the table?"
Why would they ask if he's taking it off the table if he hasn't
Because
already brought it up?
they are worried about him.
No, he brought it up. He's been bringing these up.
I would be delighted to see the quote.
Sure. Okay. Final question is, do you think all of this talk about like Canada and Mexico screwing us over on trade, do you hold him at all responsible for the fact that like he's the one that renegotiated NAFTA and now he seems to have so much like trouble with these two countries?
There wasn't even a reason to renegotiate NAFTA.
Okay, but he did, and now he hates our relationship with Mexico and Canada. Like, doesn't that?
It's fundamentally silly.
What, the renegotiation or him?
I think that. I mean, if I'm going to be honest, I think that his negotiation style involves a lot of destabilization. So what he does is he throws things out for the reaction and the reaction to the reaction. And then that allows him to maneuver in these spaces with an ease that he might not have already had.
Yeah, but he
also
maneuvered into a
sometimes
bad
completely
deal.
backfires. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't always work, right? I don't know. I do not know if this is a true story, but it's a story that's told in legal circles.
Okay.
There's a deal that Trump's trying to make in New York, and his lawyers are in the room. There's other lawyers in the room. Trump really wants this deal done. It's taken too long. He's really annoyed. So he takes his lawyers outside the conference room and he just yells at them in hearing of the other negotiation team. He says, "You motherfuckers better get a deal done. Got to get a deal done today. I'm not taking no for an answer." Sends his lawyers back in. Well, they got a deal done, but he paid double. Right? Because, you can't give that leverage away.
Okay.
I don't know if it's true or not. I think it sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
All right. Well, do you have any final thoughts or things, or where can people find you? Or
yeah, you can. I'm not streaming, but you can find me on X, where I occasionally say interesting things. Ryan C. Mullally, and my last name's impossible to spell, so it's Mullally. And yeah, support FIRE and support lawyers who are trying to get an actual discourse about what the law is, because we are a vanishingly rare breed.
Cool. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, this is great.
Cool.